Welcome to Weekend Expedition. If you're new here, this is a vlog where I talk about surviving a cult where I lived for 22 years. It was an off-the-grid religious cult. It wasn't violent or anything, just very strange, and that experience has had a lasting effect on me, and probably will for the rest of my life, I'm sure. If you're not new to this, welcome anyway. Pleasure to have you. This light is excruciatingly bright and hot, but it's the only way to get it on to film so that it looks good. So I'm going to be taking lots of sips of water, and I'll probably be dabbing my brow. I hope you can handle that. I don't remember what number episode this is. I want to say it's 9 or 10, 11, something like that. At any rate, doggone it, I was going to read a question here from the viewership. I thought that this week I would talk a little bit about dates and times and so on, and how that was different. First question from the people. This week it is NyQuil Dreamer, who has been a supporter of my vlogs from the jump. Once again, my appreciation to him. He asks, was there any added difficulty for you or other relatives of your uncle when you left because of your relation? I don't really think that there was any added difficulty for me. I think we can eliminate that right out of the gate. I don't feel like there was, golly, I don't feel like there was any, like the people in the town, and in the region, really the whole region, all the small towns around there, I never felt particularly singled out because of my relationship with them, and I don't know that any of my kinsmen who left with me, I don't know if they felt that or not. I don't think I ever experienced it. There was no, ew, you're related to that guy thing from the community at all that I can ever remember. So I don't think there was an added hardship because of that. The town of Lamoni was surprisingly welcoming, surprisingly unbiased, and very open, very supportive. And I think that I've alluded to that if I haven't actually said it in other episodes. But they were very kind. They were very generous and extremely helpful. I don't ever really remember feeling any kind of distrust from anyone because of my relationship. Now, was that a thing? Were there people that were feeling that? It's entirely possible. I heard someone, and I don't know if this was sarcastic or if someone was actually being real, that someone suggested that when we all left, because there was just a mass exodus from community. I think within the course of just a few months, there were probably 20 to 30 people who left, which I think was pretty unprecedented in the community's history. that it was some new recruitment program that we were immersing ourselves into the community, and then we would slowly begin to recruit. Um, if I remember right, the person who said that to me was a smartass and was kind of known for being sarcastic. Um, I don't know that there was any truth to that, but maybe there was. Maybe some people were paranoid. Um, Honestly, I've got to say, in a town of 1,000, maybe 1,500, or less, I don't even know what the population is anymore, that an influx of 20 people at once from a group that's existed outside the town for, 2 decades, that would be weird, but there was never really anything directed at me. As for my relations that are still in community that aren't my uncle or my uncle's direct line, I don't know. I don't know. I do know that he had, meaning he being my uncle, had uh, an almost unfailing tendency to paint himself as a victim of everything that didn't go his way. That he was somehow being persecuted or pursued by either satanic forces or evil or the fallen watchers or sorcery, any number of evil things. Um, and I imagine that my siblings that were left there, I have one sibling that still remains in community, and my other two siblings are no longer there. But at the time when I first left, I would have had two siblings there, really. I imagine hearing that sort of talk of being, all these people hate me, they turned against me, and all the very self-focused talk that my uncle was given to doing whenever someone left or whenever he felt that he had to gain sympathy in order to retain the loyalty of the people who followed him. I imagine that was very uncomfortable. It was very uncomfortable for me when they were talking about my dad and then my mom and then my sister, who eventually returned, and a multitude of friends and people that I very much loved. Always a very awkward, very just gross feeling, a feeling of self-pity and of being persecuted, and it wasn't really something that could be justified. I suppose he took leaving, and this is pure speculation. I suppose he took leaving. Wow. I just spit, so must have had a little bit in front of my teeth, and I just shot that shit out. There's nowhere that I don't go that at least some kind of comedy, even if it be only slapstick, doesn't follow. My daughter's all excited about her K-pop. Um, I suppose for my uncle that it felt very, very personal. It was his project. He had put it's his life. It's his life's work. The community is his life's work. Um, so I guess on one hand, I don't blame him for taking it personally. I think if I were doing a project and I had someone on that project for 20 years and I was very passionate about it and it was what I would consider my life's work and they just left, I think that would probably hurt pretty bad. So in a sense, I don't blame him for taking it personally. But on the other hand, I don't know how personal it was. I think there was always an element of it being personal to some degree. simply because he was the one who pushed so hard when things began to go bad. When it came to clutch time, he was always operated with very high pressure, very persistent, very tenacious, and ruthless. So there was always that need to escape that sort of domineering presence that he had. And when I left, I suppose I was leaving him, but it was also leaving the lifestyle and friends and family, and it was more diffuse, at least in my case, I think, than just an attempt to escape him. It wasn't just that. I would, and once again, this is conjecture on my part, I would suppose that most people who left felt something similar. So making it all about him, and then even when he would say, well, this person has left their kids or their family here behind in community and not thought about them and selfish, even when he was talking about someone else, there was a way that he would turn that focus to himself and just amplify his own sorrow. And there's nothing wrong with feeling sorrow. I'm not condemning any emotion he had. But it always seemed very, very, very focused. I hesitate to use terms like narcissism because it feels like that's maybe an overused word right now, and maybe it's not. Maybe there are a lot of narcissists. I don't know. I'm not a medical professional, but to see him doing what he did, and the way that he took things, and the way that he operated, feels a lot like narcissism. It also what are you doing sneaking around? No, I'm not going to go down that road. I see. So, that whole experience, and this I guess has taken a little bit different turn than I thought it would. That just stemmed from one question. Good question, by the way, Haka. Real good question. The experience of leaving was incredibly painful. And once again, I would assume that this applied to more than just me and the people who left at the time when I did. We had 22 years invested in the place, and that's a lot of time and a lot of effort. It's a lot of emotion, and faith is an extremely powerful motivator when you believe that there's scary laser weapons just over the horizon in the hands of the Antichrist. I suppose that's why leaving, at least for me, was less of a personal experience and more of a diffuse experience. It had to be a meltdown of several factors. Not just a meltdown in my relationship with my uncle, but a questioning of the validity of the way of life, a weariness of always being in want, in my case, it was worry about my son and what his future held. It was me being worried about my mental health because of all the meetings. And I suppose you could say the meetings were his fault, but a lot of people took up for my uncle just, I guess, as a way of maneuvering. And by maneuvering, I mean the politics of being seen and respected as a man or woman of God. My faith, the meltdown of my faith, I guess, was something that took a while to happen. I didn't leave because of the religion. I didn't leave because I suddenly became atheist. I left because the lifestyle was no longer an advantage to me, and the people I was around were no longer well, not all the people. The people that were leading the place where I was were detrimental to me and what I was doing with my life. I'm going to go ahead and stop there. Tape's run out. So the process of leaving and the several factors. It's hard to go back. It's hard to go back there. That was a very turbulent time. I don't know if I've spoke about this before on this podcast because I forget what I've talked about and what I haven't. Poor memory seems to be how I cope with bad shit. And it is what it is. But yeah, I decided to leave because I felt like I was going to do myself a mortal harm, or because I was going to go crazy. And I was having meetings all the time. I couldn't even walk to the well and get water without having a meeting. I was getting looks from everybody. Attending church became a very painful thing. I had a considerable amount of authority within community and a good seat at the table in terms of leadership, and that was essentially stripped away. Some of it I gave up before it could be taken, and I would say that that was simply my pride at work. I'm not ashamed of that. It is what it is. But I ended up just deciding I couldn't do it anymore. I knew where things were headed between me and the leadership of the community. And I wasn't going to have my son raised in a hostile environment, aside from all the difficulty that community would have providing for my son. And I've seen nieces and nephews that still live out there. I've seen them a few times since I've left. Should do a better job of keeping in contact with them, but those of you who are maybe fans of this blog or fans of the channel, period, understand that I fall down a lot when it comes to communicating people. I have a tendency to not deal with people who aren't in my immediate presence. Anyway, when I've seen my little nieces and nephews, they got stains on their coat, their hair is tangled and dirty, their faces are dirty, and I know that their parents care for them. I know that beyond a shadow of a doubt. I know that they're well taken care of. But, you know, when resources are that limited, the level of care you can give to somebody is likewise limited. And this may sound small, and I may have said it before, but I remember my son's first banana, and gave it to him and watched him eat that. I don't even remember where it came from. Somehow we got a banana or a few bananas. And the absolute delight that he experienced eating that banana for the first time. Of course, a kid's first banana, they're either going to love it or they're going to hate it. Most of them love it. But I guess I had a different perspective of that because I was watching him enjoying this thing, this very simple thing. Bananas are, god dang, you can buy them cheap anywhere. Watching him eat that and knowing that he was having something nutritious and something that tasted good, something that brought him so much joy, and that I had no way of knowing when he would ever get another one. It's a banana. It's not caviar. It's not a luxury item. And I remember how powerless I felt as a provider. Looking at my son, knowing that there was something that I could easily obtain for him in another place that was almost impossible for me to provide for him in that place. And that really stuck with me. That was a very weird experience. It's hard for me to relay the emotion of that. I'm sure a lot of you have lived in a place where bananas were readily available, seeing as how they're not expensive and haven't been expensive for years. I imagine most of you had bananas frequently, your whole life, whenever you wanted them, if you like them. He still likes bananas. And I can give him as many as he wants. And that to me was the big takeaway. So I left. I didn't have a job. I didn't have any prospect of a job. I didn't have a house. I didn't have any prospect of a house. I had no education. I dropped out when I was about 16, right after I took my 10th grade basic skills test in Iowa. I had no property. I had very little in transmittable skills or, kind of portable knowledge outside of how to live off the land. And I had a little son. And I stepped out into the great big world. And that was an experience, man. That was an experience. My mother lived with a friend of hers, and I moved in with her. They were gracious enough to accept me. I worked for a neighbor guy when he needed help sorting cattle and cutting fence posts, just farmhand shit. Burned some grassland, and the fire got away from us, and he was on a tractor, set the tractor tires on fire, and I ran up into a pond, got some water, and we managed to put the fire out. That was a bit of an adventure. And at this point, I was still religious. At this point, I was still trying to figure out where God was for me and how I was going to approach that. I wasn't anywhere near giving that up. Also on that farm, within the first, I lived with my mom there for a few weeks. I don't remember how long. It was a month or a month and a half, I suppose. I stayed with her. But in that course, I learned how to drive a tractor, or at least I thought I learned how to drive a tractor. And one morning, I went out and got a bale of hay on the back of that tractor, a big round bale. And I was driving back to feed the cows. And there was this little knob of road that I had to cross. I had to come out of a gate. And, well, from my perspective, had to come out of a gate and then turn. And there was this little knob. And I wouldn't say it was a heavily trafficked road, but it was frequent enough that you wanted to keep your head on a swivel. I wanted to get across that road because I was worried about traffic popping up over that little hill. And I went too fast across that road. And the bale on the back of the tractor, as I turned that corner, drug me off into the ditch, and I rolled the tractor onto my chest. And slid off, and it was a shallow ditch. It wasn't very deep, thankfully. But that tractor rolled, and the fender that was over the wheel landed on my chest, right on my chest. Didn't run the length of my body. It kind of ran across my chest like this a little bit. And that tire, as the tractor was still going, that tire was just inches away from my face, just whipping around, and my leg was caught on the steering wheel. Anybody who's grown up in a rural environment in the Midwest, especially, I suppose, understands the danger of cabless tractors. I probably should have mentioned it was a cabless tractor. And everybody seems to know somebody or be related to somebody who rolled a tractor onto themselves and ended up dying. I knew probably at least 2 or 3 people. Well, knowing in my family that had it happen, I knew of 2 or 3 people that had lost relatives to rolling a tractor. So I had that fender on my chest, and that fucking thing was heavy. I ended up pushing it up off my chest, getting my leg untangled, and walked around, shut off the tractor, walked back to the farmhouse, which was not too far down the road. And I walked in the house and said, "Neil, I just rolled the tractor." But I almost died, and that was a sobering but focusing experience, I guess. My last thoughts, just before I rolled over and everything was just a blur, I thought about my son growing up without a dad, and how he would always want to know me, but yet he would never be able to, and the frustration and grief that would cause him in his life. In a way, I suppose that served to help focus me, and kind of take away the mystery of those last few minutes, because I was certain that I was dead. I understood as I saw the rear end of the tractor creeping towards that side of the ditch. I understood that I was going to die. Right there was no doubt in my mind. Probably the strongest feeling of certainty I've ever had in my life. But I guess that it removed the fear of shit. The fear of dying. And I guess well, obviously I haven't died. I know how tense those last few moments are, and I guess that served to kind of focus me, kind of stopped worrying about things. It kind of clarified shit for me, so it wasn't all bad. It's still something I don't like to think about, because it was pretty fucking terrifying. But I got over that. I moved up to Lamoni. Those people were welcoming. Stayed with my ex-wife's grandmother for a couple of weeks and moved into a place with my brother-in-law. We used to be really close. And yeah, started working a part-time job for AmeriCorps, working with kids that were, I don't know, probably 9 or 10 to 13, 14 years old. Had some good times. Part-time manager of a thrift store, and then I worked as a assistant in the produce aisle at the local Hy-Vee food store. All at the same time there for a while. But slowly I started to get my feet underneath me. I tried to get my GED a couple of times, and I couldn't do it. Couldn't handle the classroom. The teacher was, I suppose, a good teacher. I mean, most of the people I know went to her for a GED, and she shoveled them right through. She had a great success rate with them, but I never did very well in classrooms at all. I still don't, incidentally. When I was 37, I found an organization here in town, here in Topeka, called Let's Help, and they had a math teacher there who was a math instructing son of a bitch. Somehow he was able to identify how to teach math to me, and he taught the shit out of it. I got my GED. I did really well. So, that's maybe a touch on the subject of leaving. At least for me. We'll probably come back to it. It's maybe one of those things I'm going to do in small doses. Well, that was a good question, Haka. I appreciate it. NyQuil Dreamer, whatever the fuck. You're the man. It's probably about time to shut this shit down again, almost. Yeah. Well, I suppose we're going to go ahead and reset the tape and move on to calendar and holidays. How about that? You like apples? We're going to talk about a difference in time and date. How do you like them apples? In the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I do not remember which one it is. I likely won't investigate. God dang it. Timer's reset. There was a plan for a calendar in the Dead Sea Scrolls that somebody found, or something like that. My uncle seized a hold of that and began using it. It was first identified as the Essene calendar, and then when my uncle decided that it was brought to earth by a man that's barely mentioned in the Bible, but I think more mentioned in the Book of Mormon and other apocryphal writings of that caliber. It was called the Enochian calendar, and basically how it went was like this. The first day of the year was spring equinox. And that was day 1. Every month was comprised of 30 days exactly. And the leftover time were holidays that were not, they were a day of the year and oftentimes a day of the month. Now, sometimes, no, they weren't day of the month. They were a day of the year, but they weren't a day of the month. Because that's what God wanted. And every season was 3 months. There were 12 months in every year, and the leftover days were Sabbaths that were devoted to worship most of the time, sometimes rest. So how it worked was the first day of the week was called first day. The second day of the week was called second day. And I think you know where I'm going with this. The third day of the week, third day, and so on. The sixth day of the week was preparation day. And the seventh day was the Sabbath. There was no work done on the Sabbath outside of an emergency such as saving somebody's life, or carrying an armload of firewood in the house. So preparation day, all meals were cooked in advance, all water was drawn in advance and carried to the house, all wood was at least cut and chopped and made ready to go into the fire and delivered to the home. Floors were swept, laundry was done, and so on, so that pretty much nothing that was maintenance or even productive work, that's what they call it in the community, was productivity. Productive sorts of work with longer range effects, none of that was really done. So you'd go to church for the first half or 2/3 of the day. Sometimes the afternoon was filled with meetings. Other times you would just sit around and socialize or read a book or write if you had the desire to write, or play games, whatever. And that's pretty much how the day went. So you had 5 days of very intense labor, a day of preparation, which was usually devoted to preparing for the Sabbath, although most of the time on preparation days, or prep days as they were called, because we all know that shortening words is a lot of fun. There was still work being done. A lot of times there were at least some people out tending fields or doing something productive. Sometimes it was more personal projects, such as renovating various parts of homes or what have you. Anyway, so that was the calendar. Time worked like this. On the first day of the year, the spring equinox, the moment of sunrise was the first minute of the day, and that was first hour. And then it kind of ran on military time, although it would be either 5 or 6 hours off. I think that's how it worked. It was either 5 or 6 or 6 or 7 hours off. I don't remember which, and it doesn't really matter. So first hour was roughly equivalent to 6 a.m. for half the year, and roughly equivalent to, was it 7? Was it 5? I feel like it was 5. maybe it was 7. It doesn't fucking matter. Anyways, so it was roughly 6 hours off. So you would have first hour, second hour, third hour, so on. In the evening time, it was 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th hour. So the names, maybe not all that creative, as it would turn out later on. The seasons would receive special names as they were considered to be holy watchers, which is interesting, but nevertheless, it was a thing. The calendar was considered to be sacred. And this is a suggestion from someone who lived there with me, who was actually married to my ex-sister-in-law for a while, and I still consider him a good friend. I haven't seen him for a while. He's out on the West Coast living his life. But Grant, if you guys have seen the comments from some weeks past, you might have seen his comment where he was talking about how reality, where community kind of expected the whole world to conform to their reality. And I hadn't remembered this until he mentioned it, but there was a council meeting that wanted to use our date and time and so forth on legal documents such as checks. It was eventually decided that that wouldn't happen, mostly because the check would be uncashable, and money was always in short supply. But that sort of thinking that the world would just adapt to us out there was pretty prevalent, and a utterly baffling way to think, honestly. So that was basically how time worked. Seems like I'm missing something. But that whole sort of feeling that that the world would come to our way of thinking either by volunteering or being forced by God, basically, was just a matter of course in the way of thinking. The force that would be used was an event known as the Arm of the Lord, and this followed Armageddon and the fall of Babylon and all that. And I should probably get into that at another time, but in short, the Arm of the Lord was basically God would be visible to everybody in all things. And so that, I guess that goes back to the whole righteousness thing. But it would be this undeniable force, and either you would be super wicked and you would continue in your wickedness, or you would be converted to righteousness at some point. So there's that. And that wasn't really the only thing that community expected to be accommodated on. When we would go traveling, and people would travel with a surprising amount of frequency. Honestly, I'd travel to the West Coast a few times, and as I mentioned, I think earlier, to Wisconsin several times. And that was typically funded by family members, and sometimes community would pitch in some amount of money. What that looked like is you would have to request that that money be given to you, or you would receive that for a birthday or a holiday, and if you were able to articulate why that shouldn't be kicked in, then you didn't kick it in to the communal pot. And then they would decide to support you if you were able to express really good reasons and an undeniable reason why God would want you to take the trip. Then you would have the support, and you would end up taking your trip. So there was a reasonable amount of travel. Um, but when we traveled, there was no eating of genetically modified organisms. That was considered the element of wickedness. And things made with genetically modified organisms were considered the Nephilim, or the evil children of the fallen watchers and humans. The logic that justifies that, I'm not entirely sure, because it's not very well healed. So there was that. I mean, even though genetically modified organisms, I mean, they are definitely a product of science, and man is definitely altering things. I don't see how that's a child, really, of a human and a demon. There's no real coitus involved, but it's whatever. And there was just a lot of things. Everybody had their own special little name that was either Hebrew or Navajo. My uncle spent a reasonable amount of time among the Navajo people, and became very infatuated with their way of life, and borrowed heavily from them and their worldview, considered them to be a righteous people. And that kind of influenced, or very definitely influenced, communities' worldview on living with the environment and the definition of righteousness and so on. But anyway, there was a lot of accommodations made for us, and this almost a sense of entitlement that our reality would be dominant wherever we went, and we kind of made that happen, to the alienation of many family members. But I think I'm going to wrap up a little bit, kind of pull the plug on this exact episode, and we can pick up again next week. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. What I'll talk about now is that this is hard. This is hard to do. And I've been dreaming a lot about community, and they're mostly nonsense dreams. I had one the other night where I was in community. We had to send a rocket into space for some reason. God wanted us to have a satellite or some shit. And while it was nonsense, and on waking up, you can review it as a dream, it's clearly nonsense. The feeling of being there, and the feeling of it's like a cognitive dissonance of fear and calm, of belonging, and always waiting for the other shoe to drop. I mean, that sticks with you. So that's something that's been happening to me. And I'm not sure what it all means, if I'm processing something or if I'm just reliving the emotion somewhat, but that's been kind of interesting, kind of difficult. I've talked a lot about community, and I think that I've given a reasonable, if not downright fair, account of kind of the basics of it. And I kind of have my eye on what I'm going to do with this vlog after that. So expect some changes in the future. Expect some things that will be a little different in the coming days. I'm thinking about going to a 2-a-month format here in a little bit. I'm not exactly sure when that's going to happen, so stay ready for that. And I also kind of want to shift focus from where I've been to where I am and how I've gotten here. Deficits maybe that I've turned into assets, how I've been able to convert some of the shit that happened into things that have been useful to me, how I've coped with stresses and problems that have arisen as a result of being a member of community. And just kind of going down that. I don't want it to be this big inspirational group hug sort of bullshit. I do want it to be something that maybe somebody can use in their life. Maybe if they're struggling with something, maybe they can get a handle on things before it gets away from them. At any rate, I appreciate you watching this. It's kind of been a bit of a strange episode, I know, and kind of emotional. Almost as emotional as the one I did about loss. But anyway, I thank you for your viewership, as always. Once again, if you're new here, it's the first time you've listened to this, and you've listened this far, then you're made of stern stuff, and I thank you for your time. If you haven't, please subscribe. If you want to help me out, commenting and liking on this video is always very helpful, both as a bolster to my spirits and helps my channel grow. And I love interacting with you guys, so that's always welcome. I try to respond to everybody. Sometimes I think I fail on that, but I think I do pretty good. At any rate, I think we're going to pull the plug on this, and I'll see you all next week. Thank you for watching.